Welcome, this is News in Depth. I'm your host, Klaudia Czerwińska. 123 political prisoners were released from Belarusian prisons on Saturday after talks held between U.S. Special Envoy John Cole and Alexander Lukashenko. Among them is Nobel Peace Prize winner Ales Bialicki and other influential opposition figures. In return, the U.S. is lifting sanctions on Belarusian potash. What's in it for Lukashenko? Why is the U.S. getting closer to the Belarusian regime? Are the releases a sign of a change or perhaps a smokescreen? What does all this mean for Europe? To answer these and more, joining me here in the studio is Stuart Dowell, political editor of tvpworld.com portal. Stuart, thank you so much for joining me here on News in Depth.
Welcome.
So let's begin with a quick look at the sanctions and Lukashenko's business. The U.S. has taken off the sanctions for the Belarusian airlines in September. We saw the first batch of political prisoners being released. After that, right now we're seeing the potash sanctions being taken off. So do you think that this makes a big difference for Lukashenko?
Yeah, it makes a very big difference economically and politically. Certainly, he'll be very pleased to have the US sanctions on potash removed. Potash for Belarus is kind of like a cash cow, a cash stream. That's how it props up a lot of its spending, pays for its imports. Previously, it was exporting, I think, 11 million tons, and since the sanctions from the US and from Europe, that's gone down to 5 million. Even though it can kind of export them through routes away from Europe, so to get some of that back, it's very good for him. And politically, there are all sorts of benefits. One is legitimacy coming out of isolation. I mean, that hasn't happened with this deal, but it happened before with the other lifting of sanctions, as you mentioned, and it shows that he can interact with the United States, with the Trump presidency. He can do deals with the Trump presidency without really having to change anything at home. The release of the prisoners wasn't a change in the repressive system. It was just it was a simple gesture that changes nothing at home. So it's not really any kind of thawing inside Belarus. It's a thawing between Belarus and the States, of course, but not inside. It's more of a consolidation of Lukashenko's powers. So, of course, it's very pleasing to see the images of the prisoners coming home, and on a human level, we can all be pleased about that. But there's not much to like beyond that.
I would like us to take a moment to listen to Alina Koushik, editor-in-chief of Belsat TV. I had a pleasure of speaking to her for World News Tonight on Saturday night after the release has taken place. So let's take a moment to listen to that soundbite.
That this is game which is made by Washington. We have completely different state of mind of Brussels and European countries. And we all know that the lifting of the sanctions on potash from the American side, yes, they're important, and for Lukashenko they were very important. But on the other hand, the biggest sanctions and most heavy sanctions are on European way. That's why, as representative of Democratic Forces said today, Franek Wieczorka, that yes, lifting American sanctions is for releasing people, but lifting of European sanctions is for changing situation in the country. So we all hope that someday it would happen.
Do you think that based on what Alina said, Europe is actually holding the more important cards than the US sanctions?
Well, Europe's obviously holding some cards. Your guest is right that Europe has very strong sanctions against Belarus, and also very important to mention is that the Belarusian exports, particularly potash, used to go through the Lithuanian port in Klaipėda. And in January, just before the start of the war in Ukraine, Lithuania blocked Belarus's access to that port, and that was a huge problem. Has been a huge problem for Lukashenko, and that's why he's had to That's why the lifting of the US sanctions isn't the ideal win for Lukashenko, because he still can't get the potash out of the country in the most economical way. There are different options through the Russian ports in Murmansk and in St. Petersburg, or by rail to China. That's exorbitantly expensive. So yeah, sure, Europe has cards, but this is coming at a time when if America and Europe were acting in unison, then they can put pressure on Belarus. But America, to put it bluntly, has kind of changed sides.
We've also heard from Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya, who is the leader of the Belarusian opposition. We had a pleasure of hosting her and Serhiy a number of times here in our studio. Let's hear what she had to say about the sanctions.
Of course, it is the price, but we understand that American sanctions are rather flexible. Today, they can lift them tomorrow. If some deals are not fulfilled, they might be put again. So, but American sanctions were imposed mostly for human rights abuses, and that's why it might be used, to release people. But European sanctions must be left for bigger issues, for irreversible and systematic changes in Belarus, because only today about 10 people have been declared as extremists in Belarus. So this process of repressions is continuing.
So as Svetlana said, today they can lift them. Tomorrow, if some deals are not fulfilled, they might be put again. You mentioned that the U.S. has changed sides. What other sanctions do you think that the U.S. has potentially on Belarus that they could potentially impose on them in case there would be further violations, or the cases of hybrid warfare would be still taking place?
Well, from the American side, the potash was the big sanction, and for sure they're not going to put any more sanctions on Belarus for any kind of violations of anything. We know we've known since the beginning of the year, but we've known for sure since the publication of the National Security Strategy a couple of weeks ago that America now has no intentions of getting involved in the internal politics of countries that don't share its kind of cultural traditions and heritage, and I assume that applies to Belarus. So. A couple of years ago, for sure under the Biden administration, this kind of move from America withdrawing sanctions would have been seen as a strategy or a tactic to try to prize or peel Belarus away from Russia towards the West. But under the new security strategy, that's not the way it is. This is
sorry to interrupt you, but this is interesting that you're talking about this peeling off and having the strategy, because according to the U.S. administration, the dealings which are taking place between Washington and Minsk right now are specifically aimed at that purpose of peeling Lukashenko away potentially from the sphere of influence of Vladimir Putin and potentially getting it closer to America.
Well, I think if we look at what the US envoy John Cole said a few days ago in Minsk, he said that this was part of a normalization of relations between the United States and Minsk. And normalization we can put into the broader strategy of America, which is to create strategic balance with Russia. And let's not forget that Belarus is a kind of de facto extension of Russia. Lukashenko has some kind of strategic tactical independence, but is strategically dependent on Russia. So I think if we're talking about peeling away, the American strategy at the moment is to peel Russia away from China to balance that relationship. The so-called dragon bear, that's definitely not a danger to America. So it wants to peel Russia away from Beijing, and the way to do that is to give it some breathing space in this part of Europe, to give it, some analysts go as far as calling it its own sphere of influence. We've already seen that in the peace plan proposals, particularly at the beginning, the 28-point plan, which gave Russia a say over who can join the Western alliance, NATO, and gave Russia a say even in where NATO members can put their equipment. So for sure, this is not a peeling away of Belarus from Russia.
This movement by the U.S., the normalization of the relationship between the U.S. and Belarus, do you think that this is legitimizing the regime in Belarus? Is this a sign of the U.S. saying, we can actually get along with them? We get what we want from them, we take the sanctions off. What do you think is the messaging behind it for Lukashenko's regime?
Yeah, for sure. This is America kind of cleaning house. It's getting rid of legacy sanctions that don't serve it anymore. For the reasons that I mentioned a minute ago. We've seen this as well, for example, in the Balkans, in Bosnia. The Americans lifted the sanctions against the Serbian, the Republika Srpska former president, Dudik. And this was said by Trump officials that these sanctions were a legacy of this kind of Dayton era, Clinton era kind of time. So yeah, for sure, this is America cleaning house and making way for this strategic balance that I mentioned. Yeah.
And how do you think that this sort of I would say, newfound dynamic between Washington and Minsk, how is it going to affect the Belarusian opposition? Is Belarus getting further away from this democracy that they dreamt about during the last election, which they didn't manage to achieve?
Yeah, this is clearly not good for the Belarusian opposition. It's great that they've got some of their people out. We can be pleased with that. But the Belarusian, Lukashenko was able to offer this gesture because he's acting from a position of strength vis-a-vis the Belarusian opposition. He's got that situation locked down. The Belarusian opposition effectively don't really exist inside Belarus, apart from a few small-scale activities distributing leaflets and information, and oppositionists can quickly find themselves in jail for liking social media posts and for donating small amounts of money to causes that the regime doesn't like. So, and outside of Belarus as well, the opposition, it's good that they're supported, that they're accommodated in Lithuania. That might change. They might come to Poland. That's also good. But as a force for bringing about democratic change in Belarus, they're unfortunately a very, very long way from that.
On one hand, the U.S. is dealing with Belarus. On the other hand, we have the Belarusian regime, which is in a way waging hybrid war against places such as Poland and Lithuania. We've heard from German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, and he said this could be the end. This is the end of Pax Americana. What's your position to the words by the Chancellor of Germany?
About Pax Americana, well, it's interesting that, as far as I'm aware, he's the first leader of a major European country to actually come out and say, yes, we're in a different world now, that Pax Americana doesn't exist. In other countries are still hedging their bets, maybe hoping for a change, but that's unlikely to happen. So about the hybrid war, yes, Belarus is waging hybrid war against Poland. The number of illegal crossings by migrants at the Polish-Belarusian border is down this year a bit. We don't know the full figures yet, but people say that they're going to be down on last year. But we saw last week that the Polish authorities closed down a whole tunnel, which a couple of hundred or maybe under 150 people had crossed. So that's those activities are still going on. And then we saw the rubber smuggling balloons as well. One of the outcomes of John Cole's visit to Minsk is that Lukashenko might put a stop to those smugglers. Of course, he said that he had nothing to do with it; it was just smugglers. But in a country like Belarus, with so many balloons, it's obviously a part of their hybrid attack strategy. So that would be surely good for Lithuania. The other problem that Lithuania has is that Lukashenko holds a lot of Lithuania's haulage trucks. Haulage business is a big deal in Lithuania.
And there's a lot of money involved.
Yeah, that's right.
Because of the delays.
Yeah. It's also interesting in Lithuania they have quite a fragile coalition government with one of the junior partners is a very populist party and is making a lot of noise about the trucks in Belarus, and there's something to keep an eye on.
Just before we go, I wanted us to take a closer look at the people who are released, because that's the most important, that's the crux of it all, that's the most important thing that happened. I would like us to take a moment to actually listen to a soundbite by Aleś Bialiacki. He gave his first interview after his release on Saturday. So let's have a listen to what he had to say.
Despite the fact that prisoners are being freed now, new people regularly end up behind bars. Some kind of schizophrenia is taking place. With one hand, the authorities release political prisoners, and with the other, they take in more prisoners to trade, to maintain this abnormal situation in Belarus.
So the release of these prisoners that we've seen take place, do you think that this is just a smokescreen for the regime to actually get their way while targeting those who are still against them within the country structures?
Well, I think that Lukashenko played a crafty move, because the Vyasna organization has estimated that there are about 4,500 to 4,500 have been 4,000 to 4,500 political prisoners. Around 3,000 of those have been released, and the ones that were released at the weekend, many of them were coming up to the end of their sentences. So it was a kind of a clever but cynical move. Lukashenko could still get some utility from them. If they're going to be released anyway quite soon, why not trade their earlier release for sanctions relief? And also, let's not forget that yes, they're out of Belarusian prison. That's the main thing. But they've been exiled, and depending on how those people feel about their homeland, that's also a punishment. They were dumped in Ukraine, which in itself is interesting. Most of them were dumped in Ukraine, a few in Lithuania, but for sure they're not going to stay in Ukraine. Whether they become active members of the Belarusian opposition depends on them personally and how their experiences in prison have affected their future outlook.
Very quickly, why Andrzej Poczobut, the Polish Belarusian activist and journalist, was not released? What's your opinion? Unfortunately for
Andrzej Poczobut, he's an icon and a symbol of the European and specifically the Polish element to this kind of Belarusian situation. And Lukashenko knows that the sanctions relief came from the United States, not from Europe. And Andrzej Poczobut, for example, received the Sakharov Prize from the European Parliament. He's lauded and presented as the ultimate symbol of the political prisoners, and I think that the fact that he's so high profile simply meant that he wasn't included in this round of releases.
Thank you so much, Stuart. Thank you for joining me in the studio. I really appreciate that. Stuart Dowell, our political editor of tvpworld.com portal. Thanks again for joining.
Thank you.
And so this would be all for now. Thank you for joining us here. I'm Klaudia Czerwińska, and I hope to see you back here on TVP World for more news and features in just a moment.